Hello, everyone, and thank you very much for being here. I want to start by acknowledging that Stanford sits on the ancestral land of the Muwekma Ohlone tribe. This land was and continues to be of great importance to the Ohlone people. Consistent with Stanford's values of community and inclusion, we have a responsibility to acknowledge, honor, and make visible the university's relationship to Native peoples. My name is Michael Wara. I'm the director of the Climate and Energy Policy Program, which is part of Stanford's Woods Institute for the Environment. The Woods Institute is a founding pillar of the Stanford Doerr School of Sustainability and is celebrating 20 years of sustainability leadership, bringing together scholars from across Stanford to advance understanding and develop practical, just solutions to pressing environmental problems. The Climate and Energy Policy Program combines interdisciplinary research with direct policy engagement, serving as a practical and timely, neutral voice in informing decision making on climate and energy law and regulation. Today, we will be discussing investor-owned utility wildfire safety practices. First, Eric Macomber, who is a utility wildfire legal fellow at CEP and at the Environment and Natural Resources Law program at Stanford Law School, will present an update to our 2024 report on investor-owned utility wildfire mitigation practices and maturity. After that, I will moderate a panel of experts on utility wildfire practices and regulation, and we'll discuss the broader issues surrounding utility wildfire safety and liability. There'll be an opportunity for questions from the audience during the panel, so please do submit your questions using the Zoom Q&A feature, and we'll get to as many as possible. And now, it's my pleasure to hand it over to Eric Macomber.
I'm going to give an overview of the background and substance of our report, which is part of a project looking at wildfire risk and mitigation across different utilities. So we know that large fires are becoming more common and more dangerous across much of the country, but a lot of different factors have to combine to make a fire catastrophic. Here we're looking at the factor that a utility can control, which is whether the ignition or the spark that starts a fire comes from its infrastructure. So for a long time, the conversation on utility wildfires really centered on California, which makes sense since a lot of fires have happened in California, and the state has a one-of-a-kind legal framework that makes it much easier to find utilities liable for fires. But a lot of the recent action on this subject is taking place outside of California. In particular, there was a real turning point in summer of 2023 when two things happened. In August, there were the Maui wildfires. These were devastating fires, and they happened in Hawaii, a state that hadn't really experienced fires like this before. This was a wake-up call that utilities can potentially ignite serious fires, even in areas where that hasn't really been a problem in the past. Earlier that summer in Oregon, a jury found a utility liable for the 2020 Labor Day fires. That case is still being litigated, so we don't know everything, but one takeaway is that utilities can be found liable for fires, even in states that haven't made that easier, like California has. So across the United States, for utilities, the new situation is that a serious fire can occur in your area, even if risk has been low there in the past, and your utility may be found liable for damages from that fire, which can be very, very high, even if your state doesn't have any kind of special legal standard for utilities. Taken together, this means that your practical exposure to wildfire risk may be much higher than it seemed a few years ago, even if nothing else has changed in the meantime. So we know that fires themselves are dangerous, but increasing utility fire liability also creates indirect harms for society in general. As it gets higher, liability that is, utilities seem like riskier investments, which makes it harder and more expensive for them to raise the money to build new infrastructure. That creates problems for stuff like the switch to renewable energy, because that transition is going to require utilities to build lots of new infrastructure, things like solar farms and new transmission lines. Also, higher costs and liabilities for electric utilities translate to higher rates for electricity customers, which has serious negative impacts on stuff like equity and public health. It also makes it harder to switch from gas to electricity when it comes to home appliances and cars, et cetera. All of which calls for new responses to reduce electric utilities' exposure to wildfire risk. So what can we do and what's actually happening in terms of utility mitigation? At the utility level, utilities can create a wildfire mitigation plan, or WMP. That's exactly what it sounds like. It's a plan that gives stakeholders like customers, investors, and regulators a sense of what a utility is doing to reduce its wildfire risk. We've seen the development of these plans has expanded a lot, even over the course of the last year or so. At the state level, regulators can guide and review mitigation planning and spending by utilities with the overall goal of finding the right balance between affordability, reliability, and safety. State legislators can create new sources of guidance and oversight. They can encourage or require utilities to create WMPs, and they can also build institutional capacity for regulators in order to make that whole process easier. They can also create new programs to stabilize utility finances. For instance, California and Utah have both set up state level funds to insure utilities for some wildfire damages. And we're also seeing legislation in several states to create new legal standards for fire liability that would act to contain utilities' exposure to wildfire risk in the event of a fire that's linked to their infrastructure. So all these approaches have their own pros and cons, but in general, we need to balance the need to stabilize utility finances with the need to incentivize utilities to take precautions to prevent their systems from igniting a dangerous fire. So how does all this inform our project? Basically, we're building a framework to measure the development of utility wildfire mitigation plans. Our goal is to show where that work is happening and where it may still be needed. This is part of an ongoing project. The QR code here goes to our project website. Basically, we're looking at criteria that correspond to the early phases of wildfire mitigation and tracking whether certain tools are in place that we think indicate how a utility is thinking about mitigation. We're then using those criteria to rate overall WMP maturity. The idea here is to build on general experiences from California while also recognizing that these specific details of mitigation are going to look very different elsewhere. In particular, we're looking at measures to address wildfire risk that are near-term and that are additive, so not longer-term programs like system hardening, and not standard utility practices like inspections and maintenance. So the actual criteria here are wildfire mitigation plans, like I mentioned earlier, weather stations that can measure the specific weather conditions for utility infrastructure, like the wind speed at a particular section of a power line. This can help build situational awareness, and it can inform operations and plan decisions. Reclosing disabled and fast trip. Basically, these are settings that can make it so that when something like a branch falling in a power line causes an electrical fault, the system shuts itself off faster, and it doesn't automatically try to turn itself back on, both of which prevent it from causing sparks that could potentially ignite a fire. Public Safety Power Shutoff, or PSPS plan. This is a plan to turn off a high-risk part of the system in advance so that it can't cause ignition during dangerous conditions. Doing this means the utility has both an understanding of when the fires could be high enough that the need to prevent ignition outweighs the need to keep the power on. And it also shows preemptive outreach with customers and regulators in order to create the plan and then get it ready to put into action. And lastly, shutoff mitigation. These are measures that limit the size, duration, and overall negative impacts of power shutoffs that are caused by the other mitigation tools. The idea here is that this reduces adverse effects on customers and also makes it easier to use those tools to reduce fire risk. So using this criteria, we sort utilities' WMPs into 3 levels of development, which are low, so no WMP or no PSPS plan; intermediate, so both the WMP and a PSPS plan, but some of the other criteria aren't there; and then high is where all of these mitigation programs are in place. So this is roughly where the large California utilities are, but it goes without saying those utilities still have a ways to go as well. So how did we apply these ratings to utilities in practice? Before we look at the ratings themselves, let's look at one way to think about wildfire risk. These are the Forest Service's Wildfire Hazard Potential Ratings, or WHP, for the US. They're based on a computer model that the Forest Service created to sort of help plan long-term wildfire mitigation work by identifying areas where severe and hard-to-contain fires are more likely to happen in the future. One big drawback that we should note, though, is that in addition to the sort of inherent limits of using modeling to predict real-world conditions in the future, this doesn't include where buildings are located or other kinds of community-level risk factors. So we still need more tools to understand fire risk, especially in more urban and developed areas where fires can spread from building to building. Next, these are the service territories of the electric utilities that are included in this survey, put on top of the WHP map from the previous figure. So for this report, we looked at the Western, Upper Midwestern, and Southeastern states because those are areas where fire has potential is generally higher. But as you can see, it's certainly not zero in the other states either. Also, this round of the project focuses only on investor-owned utilities. So publicly owned utilities like municipal utilities and rural electric cooperatives aren't shown here, which explains some of the gaps that you see in the states that are included. It's not that there's no utilities there, just they're not the kind that we're looking at this time around. So these are the included utility service territories, color-coded by the amount of territory for each utility in each state that's rated at moderate or higher WHP in the Forest Service model. We think of this as a proxy for where utilities may want to consider mitigation planning to reduce their exposure to fire risk, since it indicates areas where severe fires may be more likely, and a fire that becomes more severe and harder to contain will also probably create greater potential liability for a utility that ignites it. At the end of the day, you only need one ignition during dangerous conditions for a fire in a high-risk area to become a really serious problem. Lastly, this is each utility's service territory, color-coded at the state and utility level by their maturity tier as of the 2025 fire season, so basically now. The intermediate and lower tiers show up in orange and red, respectively. This actually represents significant progress just over the course of the last year, even though there is still a lot of red on the map. Not only have more utilities created mitigation plans, several utilities used on-the-ground tools like safety shutoffs for the first time starting in the 2024 fire season. So generally, we see the WMP development is high in states that require or otherwise incentivize utilities to create these plans. And it's also higher for utilities that have recently experienced wildfire, either directly or through a corporate affiliate. But it's still low in areas where wildfire mitigation planning isn't required or otherwise incentivized by regulation or by law, even for some utilities with large amounts of service territory that are potentially exposed to elevated fire risk. To us, that suggests that WMP development continues to lag behind regulation and legislation. So just turning to our final slide here, this QR code goes to an interactive map that you can use to explore our findings in more detail. I'm also going to post a link to it in the chat, or I think Molly will. And we're going to continue to update this data set as we receive new information. Going forward, we're working to expand our scope of our project to include more states and more types of utilities, including public utilities, in order to reflect the fact that wildfire risk is not by any means limited to investor-owned utilities or to the group of states that are included in this round of the report. That's it for me, and I'm going to hand it off now to Michael.
Thank you, Eric. That was great. And I think it just illustrates how the work of wildfire mitigation is really something that started in a small part of California, really San Diego, and has expanded to include many of the utilities across the West, and we think needs to even continue to expand further as the problem of wildfire in general and utility-caused wildfire becomes really a national issue. To discuss that issue, we have three really fantastic panelists to have a conversation about wildfire mitigation and utilities today. We have Riaz Mohammed, who is at Xcel Energy, where he manages resiliency and wildfire risk for the multi-state utility. We have Anne Rendhal, who is a utility commissioner from Washington State, who also leads NARUC's efforts on utility caused wildfire. And we have Mark Toney, who is a longtime lead on wildfire-related issues for the Utility Reform Network, which is one of the most important ratepayer advocates in California, and has managed the process of the rate-related impacts of all of the responses to wildfire that have occurred in California since the 2017 fires. I'm going to start off with a question for Riaz and provide each of the panelists an opportunity to introduce themselves a little bit more and also to respond. So Riaz, I'd like to hear, we've seen Eric's work on the sort of broader picture, the national picture on actions that utilities are taking to reduce their own risks of ignition. What's been the journey for Xcel in adopting many of the strategies outlined in this study? And in particular, I think Xcel stands out as a multi-state utility that's moved relatively quickly over the last couple of years. Could you just talk a little bit about that journey and how applicable the experience at Xcel is to the national picture for investor utilities?
Yeah, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you, Michael and Eric, and the entire Stanford team, not only for doing the report, but for hosting this webinar. So for Xcel, our wildfire journey really started in the 2020 timeframe. And as you mentioned, we're a multi-state utility. We operate in 8 states: Colorado, Texas, New Mexico, South Dakota, North Dakota, Minnesota, Wisconsin, and Michigan. But in 2020, we developed our first WMP, and that was in Colorado. And at that time, it contained, information that was available at the time. It addressed issues such as vegetation management, inspection, system hardening, some of those types of criteria that we used in that plan. I will say since then, we've had the ability to not only learn from implementation of that first wildfire mitigation plan, but also leveraging the experience of our peer utilities in California, Washington, Oregon, and other states that have a little bit more experience dealing with wildfires to really develop a more comprehensive wildfire mitigation plan. Not only did we do that, as we look at kind of the drivers of wildfire, whether it be climate change, drought, extreme heat, development in the WUI, we've had to update our practices to keep pace with the changing environment around us. And what that has led us to is in 2024, we filed an updated wildfire mitigation plan in Colorado, and that really addresses all the elements that you guys addressed in your study, whether it be an operational PSPS plan, a public wildfire mitigation plan, some of the mitigation measures. So that was what we did in Colorado. Then switching to our other opcos and in the other states, we leveraged the experience that we did in Colorado to develop at the end of 2024 wildfire mitigation plans to address each one of those states, obviously tailoring to some of the conditions and configurations that we have within those states. So we started in 2020. We leveraged our own experience as well as those as our peer utilities to really elevate and incorporate the lessons learned. And then that has shown out in our Colorado plan. We use that framework from Colorado and move it to our other states. How do we think this compares nationally? So, not everyone has the benefit of being a multi-state utility, but I will say leveraging the experience of our peers in this area has really been something that I have seen. I will say that, I've been working on this issue for a handful of years now. And when I first started going to wildfire conferences, it was the same 8 or so utilities in the room having the conversation. I will say now when I go to these same conferences, it is utilities from across the country who are in there really looking to learn and get ahead of the issue. So I think kind of what you've seen from Xcel in terms of its evolution is probably going to be what we see in the future with utilities in different parts of the country looking at wildfire and looking at how they can mitigate it through WMPs or other mechanisms.
Thanks, Riaz. I think that provides a nice perspective on, one of the utilities that we perceive, at least in our survey, is moving quickly, and also the kind of the evolution. And could you speak to how regulators, especially regulators outside of California, have responded to this challenge so far? I mean, you have both the perspective as one of those regulators, a longtime commissioner from Washington, but also you've played a leadership role at NARUC in really centering this problem as something that regulators need to be paying attention to and learning from each other, just as Riaz was describing the utilities are making best efforts to do.
So thank you. And again, like Riaz, thank you for having this opportunity for us to talk about this issue. Yes, I'm a commissioner from Washington and have been serving in that role for over 10 years. And during that time, we've seen this issue obviously start in California, start in Southern California, grow to Northern California, move up to Oregon. And Western commissioners in particular have been meeting and talking about these issues for quite some time. And seeing this, Washington, well, we didn't have legislation. We started about 4 or 5 years ago, just asking our utilities to file wildfire plans based on what California started doing and the California utilities to make them really focus on this risk and have them present to the commission every year, both before and after the season, what's working, what's not, what are they learning from their peers. As Riaz says, the communication between utilities has really blossomed over time. EEI has really taken a focus on this. But in terms of the national role, so as first vice president of the National Association of Regulatory Utility Commissioners, my focus this year has been on wildfire mitigation and the financial risk that wildfires, that the utility-caused wildfires create for the utility industry, which is a very important service that all of us rely on. And it's something that we need to really focus on as states to see what we can do to focus this issue. And because any financial impact to the utility is going to be a financial impact to customers. So at NARUC, we have been, with the help of the NARUC Center for Partnerships and Innovation staff, who are really leading up this work, we are developing an online guide to states. It can be for state commissioners, staff, consumer advocates, anyone, and utilities, anyone interested in learning about how to address this issue of wildfire mitigation. So we have a steering committee representing commissioners and staff and utility companies and others from across the country, really including all the regions and looking at each issue similar to the topics that are identified in the paper that you and Eric have been working on in your team. What's in a wildfire plan? What are some of the other techniques and actions that utilities can take? What are actions that states can take? We're not calling them best practices, really what are those current effective strategies? Because this is really a dynamic process and it's changing. We're learning more. There's new technologies, there's new practices, and this is really changing over time. What's the most effective, least cost way of addressing this mitigation? So this guide should be released by the end of October, early November of this year. And it will have a lot of links to various company and state practices and the state laws that are now beginning to come to fruition to address many of these issues. In fact, Washington, in our legislative session this year, passed a law requiring the commission to now approve wildfire plans based on some requirements and standards that were set forth in a statute 2 years ago for a Department of Natural Resources for all the utilities in the state, including the consumer-owned utilities, to develop wildfire plans that would include various matters. So that's what we're doing and focused on a national level, and have really appreciated working with folks like Riaz to help put this together.
Thanks, Ann. Mark, your role is really advocating on behalf of ratepayers, and obviously in California. When we look at the increases in rates that have occurred over the last decade, not all of it, but a substantial share of the much faster than inflation rate of increase in California has been associated with wildfire liabilities, but also, importantly, mitigation costs. Could you reflect on the appropriate role for utilities in carrying the liability and in preventing the consequences of catastrophic wildfire? How does TURN think about that today?
Thank you, Michael. I think there's a couple of things to think about. One is, as Eric's presentation talks about, how do we reduce ignitions? Okay, wildfire ignition caused by utility equipment. Now, in California, we have invested billions of dollars, both in trimming the trees, vegetation management, and also replacing infrastructure, okay, to stop the sparks from flying off of bare wire, or, trees falling down on bare wire, causing shorts and causing fires. And there's been a lot of progress in California. That's the good news. There are far fewer ignitions from utilities, and that's good news. The challenge is that's only part of the cost of wildfires. The other cost that ratepayers have to bear is the damage from wildfires, okay? And what we did in California, as many of you know, in 2019, we passed legislation to set up a wildfire insurance fund that was funded $10.5 billion from ratepayers and, importantly, $10.5 billion from shareholders. Pretty unprecedented. So we have a $21 billion fund, which at the time, most of the policymakers were led to believe that's going to last for 20 years. 99% chance that's going to last for 20 years. And now we find ourselves in California with the possibility. Now, got to be clear, the investigation has not been completed on the Eaton fire, but there is certainly some possibility that Southern California Edison's equipment was involved in the ignition. And there's enough of a possibility that there have been policy discussions about increasing the size of the wildfire fund by extending the surcharge that's currently on everybody's bills another 10 years from 2035 to 2045. And I gotta tell you, it does not feel sustainable every 3 or 4 years to extend the fund another $10 billion. The math won't work. You can only get away with that so long. And so part of the solution needs to be limiting liability. In California, anyway, we have an unlimited liability framework. They call it inverse condemnation, where no matter how big the fire is, no matter how far it spreads, it is the responsibility of utilities, and the ratepayers are the backstop. I think we need to put that on the table for discussion and figure out ways for limiting. Because while it's fair to hold utilities accountable for ignition, it is absolutely not fair to hold utilities and ratepayers responsible for unlimited spread of these fires, where that's not part of the wildfire mitigation plan. It's about ignition. It's not about what everyone else should be doing to build fire breaks and clear your yards and property and everything everybody else is supposed to do. I believe it's important for California to have a comprehensive wildfire mitigation plan that looks at dealing with the spread of fire, no matter whether it's the 10% that is attributable to utility ignition or the 90% of ignitions that are attributable to other causes. When someone loses their home, they really care less about who caused the fire and more about how they're going to get help.
Thanks, Mark. I'd actually tease up a question that maybe I'll ask either Riaz or Anne to address if you care to, which is that we're seeing legislative proposals and some enactment of legislation across the West right now that really focuses on changing the liability regime associated with utility caused wildfires. And I'm curious what you see as the pros and cons of these proposals, because the loss is it doesn't go away, right? If you say a utility is, like in California, strictly liable, or in other states is liable if the utility is negligent, there's still a loss. What do you see as the pros and cons of holding utilities accountable, or perhaps changing the liability regimes to limit utility liability? Would either of you care to address that?
I can start off, and then Commissioner Rendhal wants to add on. So just kind of in what I've been seeing in terms of the legislation, usually the liability regime change is tied either to a requirement that a WMP be filed and the utility is in compliance with it, or some standard that's really trying to incentivize the utility to mitigate the risk in front of them. So I think it's, kind of not only is it a utility, not only is the liability regime changing, but there's kind of the element of, in conjunction with that, it's the utility doing what they need to reduce their risk through the WMP. I will say that, Mark mentioned it, it's the unbounded liability that really impacts every aspect of our business. In terms of two prime examples that I'll raise is insurance. I think those of us that operate in states with wildfire risk have seen the availability of insurance decrease. And if you can get it, you're paying substantially more for less coverage. And I think that's driven primarily by the unbounded liability. The other kind of impact that I want to point to is the cost of capital. So we are very intensive industry in terms of capital. That's probably going to increase as we look to increase demand like we haven't really seen in the last decade or two. And that means that we're going to go to the market to get, funding for that. With unbounded liability, we really see a challenge to getting that money at an affordable rate. And those are ultimately costs that could be borne by customers. So I think kind of limiting the liability where the utility has a plan and is in compliance with that plan is really kind of incentivizing the right type of work and also keeping costs low for customers.
I'll echo what Riaz said. I think, what we're talking about is not removing the liability from the utility, but limiting it. So essentially, it's not allowing punitive damages, but allowing recovery of damage to property. And in combination with wildfire funds, such as the one Mark was talking about in California, well, that's limited to the big three investor-owned utilities currently in California. Utah has a customer rate-supported wildfire plan in combination with the liability. So it's not, again, it's not an unbounded liability, and I think PacifiCorp is seeing this in their experience because of the Oregon fires in 2020. It does impact cost of capital. Hawaii Electric experienced this after the fire, the Lahaina fire, where their the support from their credit rating plummeted. So which means they're not able to access credit to pay for the damage and address the issue that needs to be made. That's going to be more expensive. And it just creates an impact, not just for the company, but for customers, because they are going to end up paying more. So this is a way to ensure this critical service that electric companies provide continues to be provided at as affordable a way as we can, despite all of the increases that we're seeing across the board, and limiting this one area of liability. But it's not happening everywhere. It's difficult for this kind of, we're talking tort reform, and tort reform is the difficult thing to work on. But that's essentially what we're talking about here.
Thanks, Ann. So one of the objectives of our study, this study with the first version of the study was really inspired by the Lahaina fires and by the insight that while there was significant risk in Hawaii that had yet to be realized in the form of a catastrophic fire, the utility didn't see that coming at it quite as clearly as perhaps they could have, and our hope is to nudge utilities in this direction to start the journey on wildfire risk reduction, hopefully before a catastrophic fire occurs in their service territory. Do you see that? We just talked about the unbounded liability that some utilities face, and the challenges that creates for investment. Do you see utilities and their regulators in states where major fires have yet to occur starting on that journey early? That would be the hope, right? Is that we could all sort of get together and have nothing to talk about because no fires have occurred. I would love to live in that world. But do you see that happening, or do we still have more work to do in terms of really creating a national effort on this, as opposed to efforts in individual states where fires have unfortunately occurred?
I'll say, and Riaz may have perspective on this as well from his prior work with EEI and now with Xcel, is that I think the Lahaina fires, the fire in the grass fire in Texas that spread through Xcel's territory, we're seeing fires. We saw fires last year in Connecticut, New Jersey, New York, North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia, places where you don't normally expect to see a fire. So it's affecting all regions. We're seeing them in Minnesota, in the northern areas of Minnesota. So from my perspective, this is why we're getting a great response from regulators and from utilities across the country in the work that NERC is doing to try to develop information that can be shared for regulators and for utilities to really broaden their understanding of what it means to look at mitigation of wildfire risk and why it's important. So I think the response we're seeing, we've had main stage discussions at NERU conferences that have been very well attended. I think there's a lot of response. We had an initial kickoff to kick off this work on the guidebook. We had double the people who had originally intended to attend the workshop. We had a packed house in trying to kick off this work on the guidebook. So I think there is a lot of interest and a lot of focus, even from utilities who haven't experienced these fires.
Yeah, I would just echo Commissioner Rendhal's remarks from the utility side. I mentioned kind of the peer-to-peer sharing that, is a hallmark of this industry. And I will say when it comes to wildfire, those companies, whether it be the Northeast, the Southeast, the Mid-Atlantic, we're all partnering. EEI hosts, a number of convenings on wildfire, and you're starting to see the representation come from across the country.
And I'll also add that I know, starting with California, but there's also from the National Electric Sector Coordinating Council, there have been discussions for years going on, not just with EEI companies, but also those in the American Public Power Association companies and the National Electric Cooperative Association, Rural Electric Cooperative Association, talking about these issues because all of them are affected in California and have been sharing their knowledge across the country and focused on really how to reduce the risk and work with the Forest Service and the Bureau of Land Management on the right-of-ways that the transmission lines go through, to work with those entities to try to make sure they're able to mitigate that risk as well.
One of the blank spots on our map, and I recognize that folks on this panel, aren't necessarily directly involved in issues around consumer-owned utilities, but certainly, they are also a concern, and particularly in the Pacific Northwest and rural parts of the American West, because of rural electrification policies in the early 20th century. Consumer-owned utilities really do serve many people, many residents and communities. What do you think we need to do? And they have different characteristics. They're kind of the opposite of the utility that Riaz works for, in the sense that they tend to be very small, and not always, but typically are smaller and have much smaller geographic scope than some of the larger investor-owned utilities in the West. What do you think we need to do, or the best steps that we could take now to help the consumer-owned utilities, munis, co-ops, public utility districts, to make progress on this problem? Certainly in the Labor Day fires in Oregon, there's suspicion that Pacific Core caused some fires. There's also a fair bit of evidence that some of the consumer-owned utilities were responsible for ignitions as well. How do we help them show, make progress and then show that progress to customers, and importantly, in terms of the sort of unbounded liability and the costs of service issues, to bondholders, and also to the states where they operate? Does anyone have thoughts about how to address that issue? Because it's a blank spot on our map. It's something that we're going to work on as we continue our work on evaluating mitigation maturity. And we see it as an important place where some of the knowledge that's been developed by investor-owned utilities could be shared, but it's a different context as well.
Well, I'll start off with a short piece on this. I think it's important for every state to ask the question, how do we minimize all ignitions for wildfires? And that includes not only investor-owned, but publicly owned utilities also. I don't think it'd be that much of a stretch to say that publicly owned utilities need to have their own wildfire mitigation plans. You can have, legislation, statute for this, okay? And that I mean, we heard that the Palisades fire, which was even more destructive than the Eaton fire in Los Angeles, was probably started by fireworks. Okay, how can fireworks be legal in California? Seriously, it makes zero sense in the state of California that you can even have legal, and there are legal fireworks sales in California around July the 4th. Those little balloons, what do you call them? Those aluminum metal
Mylar.
balloons? Okay, mylar, whatever. That's ridiculous. Why should those be permitted? Okay, we need to get rid of as many ignition sources and spreading, policies that mitigate spreading, and it should be done, I think, comprehensively, centrally planned by each state. That's my view.
So as I mentioned, Washington passed a law, the legislators passed a law several years ago requiring all the utilities in the state to have wildfire plans and provided guidance on what should be included in those plans. Washington has 3 investor-owned electric utilities and over 60 small and large consumer-owned utilities, from munis, rural electric cooperatives, tribal utilities, and public utility districts. So some of the larger public utility districts, Chelan PUD, for example, has had a wildfire plan in place and has even instituted a public safety power shutoff. So there are some utilities that are large enough to really be able to make the investments. I will say there are other significantly smaller utilities in Washington that are full requirements customers of the Bonneville Power Administration. So they don't have generation, they are simply receiving the power and distributing it to their customers. And so Bonneville has taken on, they have a wildfire plan, they have a public safety power shutoff program in place. And so I think it's just educating and informing all of the utilities. And I do think APPA and NRECA are doing a good job of that with their members. And so we just have to, I think, instead of siloing our efforts, really coordinate our efforts, because we're all in this together in a way. This is what Mark was saying. We're all in this together, and it's not just ignitions from utilities. We've got fires popping up all over the place in Washington right now, and it's not necessarily utility caused.
So one thing that's come up in everyone's remarks, and also I'll just say I'm sort of monitoring the Q&A as it develops in the Zoom Q&A, is this issue of kind of the balance between the utility wildfire problem and the broader issue of wildfire, and relatedly wildfire liability. So let me ask the three of you, do we need to get outside of the utility space to really solve this problem? Maybe another way to frame this is, how can utilities and their regulators help state and local governments do more to reduce the consequences of all ignitions so that utility ignitions, if they occur, create fewer losses? And does this have to be something about liability, or can you share experiences from the states in which you work where utilities are collaborating with state and locals to reduce wildfire risk writ large, not just the utility share of that risk?
So I can start on that one. I do think we need to have a conversation about the holistic solution to wildfire. Utilities are a part of that, but it will require coordination with many different stakeholders to really address this problem. From the Xcel perspective, there are a couple things that I think are good kind of examples of how we've partnered with other stakeholders. So one is kind of coordinating some of our mitigation activities. I think, as we come through and do some of our vegetation management, if we can either let state or federal entities know as well to create kind of a buffer, fire breaks, so that we can kind of pair up our mitigation efforts there. Second is leveraging some of the investments that we make. So we have invested heavily in AI cameras in our service area. And those detect smoke relatively quickly, and we've allowed some emergency management offices to have access to that feed from that camera We have examples in Colorado where that has really allowed response to be timely, and then they've right-sized the response to the risk that is out there. So just that's an example of leveraging the investment that we're making to reduce wildfire more broadly. There are some grants available that are not directly available to utilities, but state and local governments can be the recipient of those. So partnering with those entities on grant applications, I think, is a great way to collectively address wildfire risk. And then just building off Commissioner Rendhal mentioned the Electricity Subsector Coordinating Council. That is bringing together, DOE, the FAA, USDA, Forest Service, BLM, really to talk about how can our collective efforts be better harmonized. One example of that is for infrastructure inspection. The FAA has been granting more beyond visible line of sight waivers for utilities to do that work more timely with more granularity. So just those are examples of kind of how utilities and other stakeholders to work together to really address the holistic risk that we're facing.
I think it also involves communities. So as the utilities are going out and working with communities, not just the emergency management officials, but the cities and the towns and the counties, so that customers understand things they can do to better protect their space, creating that defensible space around their house. So if there is a fire, you might mitigate your own risk. And this is something a lot of California communities do, and communities up and down the West, is especially if you have a lot of trees and brush around your house. If you create that space and put in some mesh to avoid the sparks getting into your house, you can limit the damage that might otherwise happen to your house. So it's also a community issue.
And in addition, just to add on, this is more than just a wildfire crisis, an affordability crisis for ratepayers. We're, at least in California, in the midst of an insurance crisis, property liability insurance crisis. And I really think part of the comprehensive plan is to get the insurance companies to provide incentives for homeowners to create the defensive space, to charge more if you don't do it and charge less if you do. Okay. We really need to send the price signals to homeowners that if you put the time and money into creating defensible space, you're going to be rewarded for it.
Well, I'll just say, note in moderator's prerogative, I've said things similar to what Mark just said and had tomatoes thrown at me in many audiences, mainly because I think we're deeply committed to the idea that electricity is a public good that needs to be provided to everyone in society, and that it can't be, and so moving toward that, not to say I think there are significant complications there, Mark, but I agree with you, and I've suggested it in other contexts.
But Michael, I'm gonna put on the table something that I know is controversial, so why not? I think we should rethink this issue of universal reliability. Okay? I think we should ask ourselves the question, if we know that the wind is going to blow more than 75 miles an hour, like we knew ahead of the wine country fires, like we knew ahead of the LA fires, okay, that maybe we should, for a period of time, shut off the grid for everybody in that area. I mean, I'm real serious about this. I think we need to come up and put things on the table, because I think people at first would say, no way. But then you ask people, well, would you rather your electricity bill go up $50 a month for the next 5 years? Or are you willing to accept 30 hours a year with no electricity to prevent these wildfires that's going to stop? So I actually, that's the kind of stuff I want to put on the table. We need to think out of the boxes we have lived in for decades.
So Mark's response now, I think, brings up an issue that is in the Q&A, and so I'm gonna raise it. I'll just say I think there is a real trade-off between safety and reliability, at least given the current system of overhead uninsulated wires that we have. Many folks in the Q&A, I think, understandably, are asking about undergrounding as a solution to this problem. What do you think the role of undergrounding should be, can affordably be in the context of wildfire mitigation? California, certain utilities in California, PG in particular, have really committed to this as a concept and faced a lot of opposition to it because of its cost. I think it's important, to sort of, and one of the goals of our work is really to get out of the California perspective and really ask what are kind of West-wide or national solutions to this issue. Riaz and Mark, would you care to comment on undergrounding and sort of the broader kind of grid hardening approaches that are being taken in the West, and what seems cost effective, what is scalable, because of course the grid is of an enormous scale, and what's affordable? And how does that touch on this reliability issue?
So again, undergrounding is not, there's no silver bullet here. You can't underground everything because that would be just prohibitively expensive. So utilities that we are regulating are looking at what are some particularly very risky areas where the winds, when the wind comes through, it's going to knock down the lines or going to knock a tree on the line. Can you put covered conductor in some areas that might lower the risk as opposed to underground? I know areas in California, I think there's different ways. You don't just need to cut a trench in. You can kind of overground, but not string it from a pole. But then there's other issues with not having poles. I'll just say there's other entities that rely on poles for their service, like communications. So if you don't have poles, are you going to underground your communications as well? So, we rely on communications and we rely on electricity. So I don't think it's just 100% the solution, but it may be a prioritized, targeted solution for certain areas.
Yeah, that's exactly the approach that Xcel has. We have targeted undergrounding as part of our wildfire mitigation plan in Colorado, and it is part of that toolkit for system hardening, system resiliency that we use. But, we look around and prioritize our work on, the level of risk that it will reduce and what is the kind of most cost-effective risk reduction strategy that we can put in place.
Of course, there's a huge difference in price between $4 million a mile to underground lines and $800,000 a mile for insulated overhead lines. A couple other things is timeline. It's much slower, takes far longer to do undergrounding, just does. And so there's a lot of people in high fire risk that are like, I would rather get it done fast. Instead of waiting for 5 years, if I can have it done this fall, and cheaper, I think it's worth it. But also, those aren't the only things. I saw a report that said that fast trip technology was the major factor for reducing ignitions in the PG&E territory, and that's significantly cheaper even than overhead power lines, and is correct. It's a suite of measures that have to be taken in order to reduce effectively and affordably ignition risk.
This is a silver buckshot issue, if there ever was one, and I think it's that we're trying to sample in our work for that mix of policies and also the ones that can be taken to your point, Mark, quickly, that are largely operational in terms of their approach. We've been talking so far about largely state issues and sometimes local issues when we talk about defensible space. The most destructive fire in California history prior to the LA wildfires was the Camp Fire, which was caused by a high voltage transmission line. There was another fire in California in 2019, the Kincaid Fire, also caused by an aging transmission line mechanical failure. And as Mark mentioned, I think there's at least a suspicion, although by no means proof at this point, that a transmission line may have been the cause of the Eaton Fire. All of those lines are regulated as a part of a FERC-regulated, process, a federal process. In California, they're managed by an ISO. The operational decision making is managed by an ISO. The actual construction and maintenance of the lines is managed by the member utilities to the ISO, the transmission owners. But I guess I want to ask the three of you if you could share a perspective about if there is a federal role in all of this, or if there should be, given the federal oversight role for the high voltage transmission network. And if so, what should it be? Or do you have any thoughts about that?
As you said, operationally, these lines are built and operated for the most part by the utilities, but they can be also operated by RTOs, ISOs. On a national level, so the National Electric Reliability Corporation, or NERC, sets the requirements for the bulk power system operation. And so should they be looking at different requirements for safety for wildfire? Or is that the IEEE, which I don't even remember what the acronym is now, but it's electrical standards? Are there certain standards that should be set and that those are the baseline? Maybe there's a federal role for, and I know you've talked about this before, Michael, of a federal backstop, because there are many utilities that can't afford to do the wildfire fund that is in California. They're so small they can't afford it in California and they can't afford it in other states. So is there a role for both standards on the bulk power system and standards and some sort of backstop? But I don't think, FERC is not going to be issuing rules per se on, operation of transmission lines. That would be NERC, I think.
Any other thoughts?
I don't have anything to add at this point.
Okay. We're almost out of time, and I just would offer the three of you, if you have any closing comments on, the progress that we've made on wildfire risk in the last year, what you see as the big objectives that we'd like to see in the coming, 12 to 24 months. I'd love to hear your thoughts because I have deep respect for all three of you.
I guess I'll start, which is NERC is going to finish its guide on wildfire mitigation and financial implications for utilities to help continue to share the information that utilities are already sharing with each other about how to mitigate this risk and different techniques that states and utilities can take. That's one way to start. And it's also going to share some of the work that legislatures are doing in this space in terms of different laws and rules on wildfire plans, liability limitations, securitization, other methods to affect the financial implications.
Looking forward to seeing the report.
I'll just say that, we at Xcel, I mentioned we developed our wildfire mitigation plans for all our states at the end of 2024, but that doesn't mean that our work is done. I think over the next year, we're going to continue to refine our approach to mitigating wildfire risk and really focus on kind of that customer element of the work that we're doing. And that's key for us. So that's kind of what we envision for the next year, is just further refinement of our wildfire work in terms of, what needs to be done the next year. I think the liability and the insurance questions are ones that are really going to be at the forefront of people's minds in the next year, because I think as we go to renew our premiums and go to the market for capital, that unbounded liability is something that's going to need to be addressed in some capacity.
So, what is the most fair way to pay for wildfire prevention and for wildfire damage? And I'd like to remind people that when we look at utility rates, the lower your household income, the higher percent of your income you pay for an essential service. Okay, the electricity, absolute necessity. So that doing it that way is basically it's a tax on consumption. It's a consumption tax. Now let's look at income tax, particularly in California and many other states where we have a progressive income tax, which means the higher your income, the higher your tax rate, the more percentage of your income you pay into the tax system. And in fact, if you are a low-income family, low-income working family that qualifies for the earned income tax credit, you may be paying negative income tax in that your refund may be higher than what you contributed. When's the last time you heard of a low-income family receiving a negative monthly bill? I'm saying this because sometimes when I say that it would be far more equitable to raise the income tax revenue for wildfire costs rather than rates, policymakers say, what difference does it make? One pocket or another pocket is coming out of? It's actually very different. I believe that preventing wildfires benefits all of society, not just utility customers, particularly because the spread of fires is not, beyond the ignition, is not under the control of utilities. And we need to put on the table a discussion about how these costs can be more equitably distributed.
Well, with that, we need to conclude. Thank you to the audience for attending, and thank you so much to our panelists and to Eric Macomber for speaking with us for the hour and for the presentation. Have a lovely day, and we hope to see you on the next Climate and Energy Policy Program webinar.